Hello, everyone. Now, if you're watching this program, then it probably means that travel is something you like to do, that you're interested in, that you care about. And if that is the case, then please keep watching, because my guest today is someone who, together with his wife, created the best known travel guidebooks, many of which you will have at one time or another stuffed into your backpack before heading out on a new and exciting travel adventure. I'm talking about the iconic Lonely Planet series, and to chat with me about that and travel in general, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome to Viking.TV from his home in Australia, Tony Wheeler. Tony, welcome to the program, and it really is an honor for us to have you here. Thank you so much for your time. And I guess my first question to you, Tony, should be, why Lonely Planet? How did that name originate?
It's a story I've told too often. The name is a mistake. We'd done our first book. We needed to find a name for the publishing house that was going to publish this. And we'd just been to see a rock and roll band on the road movie, Mad Dogs and Englishmen. It's got assorted rock stars who have passed on to sing elsewhere than on Earth. Principally Joe Cocker, who did a song in the film called Space Captain, and there's a line in the song that goes, "Once while traveling across the sky, this lonely planet caught my eye." And I said to Maureen, that sounds good. Why don't we call it Lonely Planet? And she said, good idea, except actually Joe sings Lovely Planet, not Lonely Planet. So the name has been a mistake from the very beginning. It's a 50-year-old error.
one that follows you for the rest of your life. I mean, in a way, Lonely Planet works a lot better than Lovely Planet.
Oh, absolutely. I don't think it would be got anywhere as much as it has done if it had been called Lovely Planet. Too easy.
And could you ever, Tony, could you ever have imagined that what began on a kitchen table in Melbourne in 1972, where you arrived with just 27 cents in your pocket, would eventually grow into the world's largest independent travel publishing company with, over 150...
I should correct at the very beginning that it was at that point Sydney rather than Melbourne. Lonely Planet had its first birthplace was Sydney. Later on, Melbourne came into the picture. But no, we had no idea at all. We did one book and were amazed that it did as well as it did. And then we thought, let's do another one. And that did even better. And then, other people started joining us and the whole thing grew like Topsy. But no, we had no idea it was going to become as big as it eventually was before we departed. And of course, I'm now 14 years down the line. Lonely Planet has carried on without me. And that's always a good thing to see when the children leave home and make their own way in the world.
Well, it's a remarkable achievement. And, it's always fascinating to hear how success begins. And I mentioned that kitchen table in 1972. Just tell us how you came to be there and what was the thinking behind that first guidebook that you and your wife, Maureen, put together.
We were classic hippie trail travelers. That was a big thing to do back in that era. Like many other trips, there's the Gringo Trail and the route down through Africa and the Silk Road, which I've traveled on quite recently. But we were on the Hippie Trail. We started out, excuse me, we started out from London, and the idea at the time was you went by some route or other to Kathmandu, and Kathmandu was the other end of the Hippie Trail. And then a lot of people like us continued on beyond there. We went on through the rest of the subcontinent, down through Southeast Asia, and eventually ended up in Australia. And the idea had been that we would spend 6 months getting to Australia. We'd work in Australia for a while. We'd save up enough money to travel back to London. But as it turned out, instead we started a publishing company. Essentially because we had a fantastic time. It was just a great trip. It was a great trip from beginning to end. And then when we were living in Sydney, which the plan was to live in Sydney for 3 months and save enough money to come back. And instead it became, let's live in Sydney for a year and save enough money to travel for another year. And in that year, so many people asked us, what did you do? Where did you go? How much did it cost? All those sort of questions, that we created Lonely Planet to answer them.
You know, when I read the story of that overland trip that you made, one of the most remarkable things about it is that, tell me if I've got this wrong, that you started with a $90 car in London, and it got you to Afghanistan, where you sold it.
Well, they made reliable cars in those days.
Oh, they really knew how to make cars, didn't they? Yeah.
Yeah, it was a great car. Wish I'd kept it. And we sold it for a small profit and carried on. But of course, lots of other people, you know, that was a little mini. And I was just last night talking to somebody who did a similar sort of trip at a similar sort of time. And she was saying, yeah, but we had a Morris Minor. So yeah. And, you know, around London today, you'll still see Morris Minors. They carry on despite wherever they may have been. And the real vehicle to own, of course, was a VW Combi. You know, the Combi van was was definitely the Hippie Trail hippie vehicle. They still look good. You know, you do see Combis still. I've seen them all over the world, and you know, they still look like a vehicle you should jump in and drive to the other side of the universe.
But first, you have to paint flowers on the side. You know.
Painting flowers on the side definitely does help. It's, you know, it's like speed stripes on a car. You know, it goes faster when it's standing still. Well, the flowers do the same thing. It travels further.
So in the 1970s, the world of travel was very different from how it is today. And I guess there wasn't much available in the way of guidebooks at that time.
Yeah, I mean, that was the, you know, as it turned out, advantage to us, that we were doing something in virgin territory. And there were guidebooks. You know, I always think of one of the classics of that era before we came along was Arthur Fromer's Europe on $10 and then $20 and then however many dollars it became a day. And it was a classic guidebook. You know, it was a guidebook for people going around Europe who wanted to find these things. And the same era, the American student travel series, Let's Go. And I can remember the first trips as a teenager I made to Europe. I had Let's Go, and it showed me where to go. And we didn't invent something new in that respect. We just went to new places. But Let's Go and Europe on $20 a day were guides to Europe, whereas we were doing guides to Asia and the sort of places that were coming into. I think it was a question, you know, of going further than our parents have gone. You know, our parents might have gone, when they got around to leaving England, they got as far as Spain, and the next thing is you went over to Africa, to Morocco, and you got as far as Greece, and then you crossed into Turkey, and the horizons kept getting wider. And a lot of other things were changing at the same time. You know, it was a question of the horizons getting wider. The boomers, you know, I'm a classic boomer era creation, and the boomers were coming out on the road in big numbers, and more of them than their parents, and going further than their parents. And then, you know, the methods of travel. I think, you know, as soon as jumbo jets came in and you could go further and faster and cheaper, that all became important. And I remember during that, we only made one flight on that whole route from London to Sydney, and that was Burma, because you couldn't cross Burma by land. You still can't very easily. You had to fly over Burma, and we did that with Thai International. And Thai International, is that an airline? Never heard of them. You know, those sort of airlines were coming into existence at the same time. So things were getting wider in all sorts of ways. We came along at the right time.
So what is it? How would you describe what makes a great guidebook? What are the constituent parts that go towards making great? Because if I'm right, that what was wonderful about Lonely Planet was that it wasn't just telling you where to go and what to do, but it was expressing opinions.
Yeah, I think that became a part of the guidebooks as well. That there'd be previously they'd been apolitical, and we were not apolitical. But the politics came into it as well. Because if you're going to go to a country and understand it, you need to know more about it than just what the food is and what time the bus leaves. So I think the history and background was an important part of the books we were creating. But at the same time, you also need to know what time the bus goes, and you need to know that when you come out of the train station, you turn right and you find some very nice little hotels to stay. You turn left and you get mugged. That's important information. So that came into it as well. And we go to these places because we want to try the interesting local food and know what the local beer is and these other things. So all of that went into it. So there was a serious element to it. But at the end of the day, it's got to be fun. If you don't enjoy yourself, you're not going there.
But given your childhood, Tony, it's not surprising you became a travel writer, because your father's job meant that you grew up in all kinds of places around the world. And I'd just be interested, do you think that was that a positive thing or a negative thing for a child?
I think it's a neutral thing. My father worked for BOAC before it became British Airways, and he almost worked for Imperial Airways. It goes back that far, but Imperial Airways became BOAC during World War II, and he joined BOAC right after World War II, and he worked in different countries around the world for BOAC, and I tagged along. Fortunately, they didn't send me back to boarding school in England. That would be the standard thing to happen. But instead, when I was very young, I was living in Pakistan, and then I was living in the Bahamas, and then I did really all my high school years in America. So I'm a product of American education. Came back to England just in time for GCEs. So yeah, I did have a peripatetic upbringing, being dragged from one place to another. But I don't think that necessarily, I know lots of people who never went anywhere when they were younger and became great travel enthusiasts. My wife Maureen amongst them. So, just because you travel a lot when you're young doesn't mean that you're going to really want to keep traveling when you're older, or vice versa. Maybe the fact that you didn't travel will make you want to travel more. I don't know. It's an open question, and of course things have changed a lot these days. That I was unusual at that time that I had flown the odd place. You met lots of people then who had their first flight when they were 18 years of age, whereas now you're a pretty unusual 18-month-old if you haven't traveled somewhere. It's a different world.
Well, they say travel broadens the mind, but I can imagine as a child you might have sometimes resented being hauled off to yet another school, and you had to make another group of friends and learn about another.
I don't think I think as a kid you always think that whatever you go through is normal. Doesn't everybody do that? And I was constantly being pulled out of one school, and I'd be fairly accurate to say I never finished 2 years in the same school without being transferred to another one. But I always found it interesting. I was in, what you'd say to people, what's inspired your interest in travel? And it's obviously going places inspires an interest. But back in my era, things like stamp collecting. If you're they don't exist anymore. But stamps, what are those? That's a thing you had before email. But in the stamp collecting era, you got these stamps from all these different countries, and you realized how many countries there were in the world by collecting the stamps. That sort of engendered an enthusiasm. If you've seen the stamp from the country, you'd like to go to that country.
Yes, I remember collecting stamps myself. But you have two children. Tony. So did you repeat your childhood with them and just take them around with you?
No, yes and no. I mean, it's funny how sometimes they complain about they were dragged here and dragged there, and they really weren't too much. During their entire growing uphood, they spent 2 years living overseas. One was we lived in San Francisco for a year, setting up the Lonely Planet office, American office. But they were at that point, it was preschool. Our daughter went to a Californian preschool thing for a year, and probably had terrible effects on her. Californian education, I approve of that. And then the second one was when they were teenagers. We lived in Paris for a year, and they both went to an international school in Paris. And that obviously was a much more formative thing because, they it's great. I think they both look back on it with a lot of favor. There they were in Paris. What a great city to live in. I love Paris, and don't we all? And they were in a very international milieu there with students from all over the place. But apart from that, we took them every vacation. We went somewhere. There was never a holiday we didn't get up and go someplace. And they may have complained about that. Couldn't we just go to the beach like everybody else? But they survived. It didn't interrupt their education, put it that way.
Tony, in 2007, you wrote a book with a very eye-catching title, Badlands, a Tourist on the Axis of Evil, where you visit the kind of countries most of us would go out of our way to avoid visiting. What was that experience like, and how much evil did you discover?
Well, it was, I say it was inspired by George W. Bush. When he said there were countries so bad that they constituted an axis of evil, my first thought was, well, I want to go there, which I did do. And, countries that are sort of off the rails, I've always found interesting in all sorts of ways. And some of them are off the rails. I think, Iran, which was, front and center on Mr. Bush's axis of evil, it's a strange place because it's got it's had terrible governments, whether it was the Shah's government installed by the Americans and the British, or the Ayatollah's government that followed it. They've had terrible governments all the way down the line, and yet the Iranian people are wonderful. I've been to Iran a number of times and had lots of interactions with Iranian people, and they're terrific. You see what they're going through at the moment, trying to overcome their government's madness, and you've got to admire them. So Iran is one of those sort of love and hate places. And I think, the other country, which I put in my Badlands, and I went back there to visit it again. I hadn't been there since the 70s, but I went back to Afghanistan in 2007 or so. And, Afghanistan's a wonderful place. There I am having lunch in a chai khana in roadside in Afghanistan, and entering Iraq as well. And I know lots of people who've been to Afghanistan, and they've all had interesting relationships there and interesting times there. It's been an interesting country for them. And if only I don't know, they could sort out the country's problems. A lot of tourists would love to go there if you could go there safely.
If a lot of people say that traveling alone is the best way to travel, what are your thoughts on that?
I'm, again, like many things, I'm very ambivalent on these things. But I do travel alone. The next trip I'm doing, I will be by myself. I'll be bumping into friends along the way, but essentially I'll be by myself. But equally, I've just come back from a week traveling with Maureen, my wife, and I'm just about to go away traveling with a group of friends. And I'm organizing a trip in September there'll be 9 of us. So Maureen and I and 7 other friends.
Fantastic.
So any of those things work. I enjoy all 3 for different reasons. You and your partner, you've got someone someone to talk to over dinner at night and to kick around what you've seen and what you liked and didn't like. Larger group of friends, there's more kicking around, more ideas popping up. And equally, when you go by yourself, you never have to have an argument about anybody. There's never a dispute about whether that was a good restaurant or a bad restaurant, or the right hotel was chosen or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They've all got plus points, every way of travel. Even with kids. I don't travel with children anymore, but kids are, when our kids were small, they're great to travel with. And in fact, just recently, I've now got one grandchild. She's 3 years of age. She and I went on the train the other day, and she took my card to swipe me in to make sure I was traveling legally, and she knew how to do it already. And we looked out the train window and saw the world passing by, and so there's travel with grandkids rather than travel with kids.
That's adorable. That's adorable. Tony, you sold Lonely Planet Publications in I think 2011. Was that a hard decision to make?
Yes and no. I mean, it was. It's a bit like different forms of travel, isn't it? On one hand, it had been our life for so many years, and
exactly.
Everything about us was tied up with Lonely Planet, and and I loved doing it the whole time. I still have quite a lot of contact with Lonely Planet writers and other Lonely Planet people, and the writers, I think all of them, loved doing what they were doing. If you could say, what's the perfect job? They'd say, I've got the perfect job. I'm a Lonely Planet writer. I love going to those places and writing about them. And I did too. I loved writing about the places when I was wearing my writing hat, and I loved putting on the publishing hat and publishing those books as well. So it was a wonderful job. It was a wonderful company to work for. I know lots of people have said, that my years at Lonely Planet were the best job I ever had, and for me too. But equally, that time to move on. It's like kids leaving home. They grow up, and you shouldn't keep them at home forever. If they don't leave on their own accord, you should push them out the door. And it's probably the same with the business. They've grown up. It was time for me to move on, make its own way in the world.
Well, it certainly made a great impression on me. I mean, I remember getting on the Magic Bus and going from London to Athens, and having a Lonely Planet guidebook to Athens or to Greece in my pocket. Did your children ever think of joining the company?
Both of them worked for the company for a while in different ways. My son was in the sort of tech department, and he's still sort of in tech today. And our daughter Tashi, Kieran's our son, and Tashi our daughter. She worked as an editor in the publishing side, and in fact, I've just got back from Norfolk Island. Norfolk Island is 2/3 of the way from Australia to New Zealand. It's actually closer to New Zealand than it is to Australia, and it's a kind of a curious island in that it's not totally part of Australia, but nor is it an independent nation. In fact, I was talking to an American earlier this morning, and I said it's a bit like our Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico isn't an American state, but nor is it an independent nation. It's not in the United Nations. It's sort of balancing between the two. And Norfolk Island is that way. And I'd only a couple of years ago, I'd read and then wrote a blurb line or forward to or something for a book about Pitcairn Island and then Norfolk Island. And the guy who wrote it said, "Oh, I used to work for you. I was a Lonely Planet writer, and my editor was your daughter Tashi." If I'd remembered that, I'd forgotten it. So yeah, she was involved with it, and that sort of bounces back occasionally when I meet someone else who's contacted Lonely Planet. It was not me, but it was my daughter.
Tony, I'd love to talk a bit about just travel in general. The great David Attenborough once said he wished the world was twice as big and half of it still unexplored. And working with Viking as I do, I get to travel a lot, but I admit I do sometimes get nostalgic for that pre-digital age when you could just head off somewhere not really knowing where you're going or how you're going to get there or what to expect when you arrived. Would you agree that travel shouldn't be too easy, that there should be challenges involved?
Yeah, challenges are good. And the challenges are still out there. And if you want to go someplace and find yourself off the grid, you can still do it. And I'm sort of disappointed if a year goes by and I don't go to someplace I'd never heard of before. And for me, the best example of that was last year. I was in Chad. It's north of the Central African Republic. It's south of Libya. It's slightly to the west of Sudan and slightly to the east of Niger. So, it's a great location. And it was just a really, really interesting country. I was astonished how interesting it all turned out to be, and what an interesting time I had there. But it ain't easy to get there, and it's either going to be either an awful lot of effort or an awful lot of expense, one or the other, and possibly both. But Chad was great, and there was a country that didn't have all the things we expect: Wi-Fi and internet and electricity, even, or running water. But it was great, and that sort of thing happens every year. I'll go somewhere, and I'm off the grid, and it's interesting to be on the grid. I've got quite a bit of on the grid travel coming up in the next 12 months, but hopefully there'll be a bit of off the grid travel as well.
But I think social media has a lot to answer for. When in the way that people travel now, it often seems to be more about getting that perfectly curated photo or that selfie.
I went to Rimini, Ravenna as well, just up the road from Ravenna. Wonderful mosaics, a couple of thousand years old, early history of Christianity, and I'd had a couple of really nice days there, and it never felt crowded. And I kept thinking, this city is so wonderful, and these churches I'm in are so beautiful. Where are the tourists? Why aren't I being crowded in? And that's good, if you can go to these sort of places. I went to a little independent nation of San Marino last year, which it's good for a day. You wouldn't want to have more than a couple of days there, but a couple of days in San Marino is perfect. And again, not many tourists. I was kind of surprised they didn't have a bigger tourist flow.
It just occurred to me, maybe the ultimate Lonely Planet guide will be the guidebook to another planet. Maybe Mars. Maybe that's the future.
Suggested. I went down to see a space launch once, and the guy who invited me down there, he was the one who takes your millions of dollars and gets you up to the International Space Station. Not just the Richard Branson up and straight back down again thing, but actually staying up there for a couple of weeks at huge cost. And he had the idea. I said, it's a great idea, and it was, but it's a small market. There aren't many people who are going up to the International Space Station. But I know.
Who knows in the future? Yeah, who knows?
Who knows?
It's the 50th anniversary of Lonely Planet is coming up soon, I believe. Are you going to be celebrating that in a particular way?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, as I say, I'm not involved with Lonely Planet anymore, but I know they are planning to, in some way, do something for the 50th and create some publicity for it. And I've said, put me in front of a camera and I'll talk. So yeah, they will be doing something to celebrate 50 years. And we did our first book 50 years ago this October. So this last year I've been in place thinking, oh yeah, 50 years ago I was in Afghanistan, or 50 years ago I was just leaving London. And 50 years ago, later on this year, I will have published the first Lonely Planet guide. And so no doubt I'll be standing in front of something, holding up one of the original copies and saying, there it is, it's all gone from here.
Do you still have that original manuscript, the one that you wrote back in 1973?
Oh yeah, I've got a handful of first edition copies. I've got a storage cabinet somewhere with them locked away. Not that they're worth anything, but it's kind of nice looking back at those. And every now and then I have to, for some reason, pull one of the early ones out and look something up and think, oh yeah, there it was all those years ago.
So you're still writing quite a lot, am I correct?
I'm not writing any guidebooks. I keep thinking I should. It'd be good to have the incentive, if you're a writer, if you don't write something this week, you don't have food on the table on Friday night. And fortunately or unfortunately, I'm not in that situation. I don't need to do a damn thing. I could just sit back and watch television if I was a television watcher. Um, but I still love travel. You know, I still like going places, and you know, I'm disappointed if a year goes past and I haven't been somewhere that I've never been before, some country or something. And last year, I went to 4 countries last year: Chad and 3 other countries in Africa that I'd never been to before. And Africa has a lot of countries, so I'm not going to run out of places.
And Tony, doing all the traveling that you do, is there any one item that you will always take with you that you'll never be without?
Oh yeah, I'm looking. Where's my mobile phone? It's right here in front of me and charging up right now.
Oh,
Look,
I thought it
there's
was non-digital or something. Like a
I'm
corpse.
saying non-digital. Well, that's a different question, isn't it? Because really, you know, what do you need? You know, if you've got your passport and a credit card, you know, you could step out. And I remember someone who did that once, who decided to set off on a trip with nothing but his passport and his credit card and see how it went. You know, well, the first thing, as soon as you get there, you've got to buy yourself a toothbrush.
Yeah.
And if you're a male, you've got to buy yourself a razor unless you want to grow a beard. So, you know, that was a little interesting experiment on what you needed. And you don't need, I'm a great believer in traveling with only carry-on baggage. I don't want to be waiting around the carousel. I don't want to be worried that my bag won't turn up. So as much as possible, I do travel carry-on only. And it's a good, you know, if you need another shirt, you can always buy another shirt, or you can wash the one you've already got. You don't need as much as people, you know. And it's rude of me to do it, but I do sort of look at them and think, what the hell have you got in that bag? Is that all?
You know the three sock trick. You know, with the rotation. So you take 3 socks and you wear 2 of them, and then you move them all along one, and then you wash the one, and then they go right, and you start again. So
there's a line about that with Antarctic underwear, that you wear it one way for 3 months, and then you turn it around, and then you put it inside out, and the way it lasts a year. I don't want to be sitting next to you.
No, yeah. Tony, that's great. Anybody watching who wants to know more about the fascinating Lonely Planet story should get a copy of Tony and his wife's book titled Unlikely Destinations. There it is on the screen. And Tony, we'll let you go now. But thank you so much for sharing your stories and giving us your time. It's been a real honor for you to have us on Viking TV. And we all wish you safe travels.
Thank you very much. I will try to do that. That's an important thing to do.
Stay safe.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Tony.